The Trump administration has announced that phase one of the U.S. trade deal with China will be signed on January 15th. That's according to White House officials. The two nations have not yet finalized the deal, but the signing would be the first pause in nearly 2 years in the ongoing trade war between the world's two largest economies. Akiko Fujita joins us now. She's an anchor and a reporter for Yahoo Finance. So, Akiko, I just feel like there aren't a lot of details. What do we really know at this point?
Yeah, what we know right now is everything that's come from the White House, right? So on the one hand, we know that, number one, there has been a purchase agreement. So U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer has come out and said, essentially, the Chinese have agreed to purchase up to $200 billion in additional goods over the next 2 years. The Chinese haven't confirmed that, and that's going to be the big question mark going into this. In addition to that, Lighthizer has said that they have agreements on enforceable mechanisms for intellectual property as well as tech transfers. So again, we've been told that there's an 86-page document that is currently being translated, but we haven't seen the document. So there's still a lot of question marks about the details on that front.
Have we heard anything from the Chinese about this?
So the Chinese haven't confirmed any of the details that have come out of the White House. We do know that Vice Premier Liu He is coming to Washington. We have this report from the Wall Street Journal today saying that, look, the two sides are going to meet biannually, so twice a year, moving forward to continue on these other structural issues that are really at the heart of the trade war and the reason why the administration has said they've started all of this.
Is there a way to say which country needs this trade deal in place more?
I think that's a tough one to say. I mean, you look at the two largest countries. And so clearly, if you look at the Chinese side, we're looking at growth last year that was among the slowest in 30 years. So they have clearly been hurting as a result of the trade war. But you look at the U.S. and you look at just who has been paying for it, right? We have this multiple studies, you could say, that have come out and said that the U.S. Businesses, consumers have been paying roughly $40 billion for the tariffs because the goods coming in from China are being taxed on the Americans. So, you know, I think it's not one of those things where you say, it's not a binary thing. We've seen hits to the economy on both sides.
You know, you mentioned hits to the economy. So the Commerce Department recently released reports saying that since February of 2018, the trade war has cost American companies $46 billion. So let's say phase one of this deal comes into effect. What happens then at that point?
Well, so, you know, even though this phase one deal gets signed, there's still tariffs in place.
Right.
There's tariffs on $250 billion in goods. There's tariffs on $120 billion in goods. So what we have right now doesn't necessarily change. It simply doesn't escalate. I think what's going to be interesting to watch moving forward, if you're talking about the business impact, is how are American companies now going to move forward? We've heard this word decoupling mentioned over and over, that increasingly these two countries are moving away from each other. And this tension over the last 2 years has been a lesson for a lot of these American companies who say, maybe we need to start moving our manufacturing to places like Vietnam, other parts of Southeast Asia. Maybe we don't need to put all our eggs in one basket, so to speak, in China. So that's something I think long-term that you want to be looking for.
One of the big concerns that Americans have had is the theft of intellectual property. Do you expect that to even be touched at this point?
Well, Robert Lighthizer has said that it has been addressed in phase one, but we don't know what has actually been agreed upon, right? And you know, one of the things I would point out is that we've been told from this administration is that the translation is being worked out. And the translation on this 86-page document is being worked out. And when you go back to how this trade war has evolved, post G20 summit last year, that's where things got held up. You know, the Chinese said essentially that we had agreed to, the U.S. had agreed not to add additional tariffs. The U.S. said that's not what they agreed to. And then things kind of fell apart. So
you said there were problems initially with the translation.
With the translation.
That led to the Chinese saying this isn't what we agreed on.
Exactly. And so, you know, that's to be expected. You've got two countries with two very different languages. But I think that's something that you want to look for, at least on the issue of tech transfers, because as far as we know right now, American companies who want to do business in China still need to have largely this partnership in place with a local Chinese company. And there are concerns that they have to hand off their technology in order to gain access to the Chinese market.
Akiko, ultimately, for folks at home, how is this going to impact their lives if this trade deal does go through of some sort?
I'm not sure you're going to see an impact immediately, because what we have seen is, even though these goods coming in from China into the U.S. have been tariffed, have been taxed over the last several years, companies have largely taken the load. They have held back on their business investments so they don't have to pass on the costs to the American consumer. And so, oftentimes we talk about the economy, saying the sentiment is still very strong among consumers. I'm not sure the trade war has exactly affected that just yet. I think what you want to see, though, is that this is just the first step. This is just a pause. These discussions are going to continue, and we'll certainly have to see if that's going to continue to weigh on sentiment among American consumers.
Let's say it doesn't work out. What does China have to lose at this point? What's on the table for them here that they could risk walking away from?
Well, if you look at the economy itself, it certainly has been struggling. I pointed to the 30-year low in terms of the growth that we saw last year.
Yeah.
Just this week, we saw the Chinese central bank step in to try and essentially cut the reserves that banks need to hold so they can continue lending. So the fact that the Chinese government has continued the stimulus measures does point to the fact that they do see the slowdown. You could argue, though, despite the slowdown we're seeing there, the Chinese have all the arsenal there, right? They don't have to be held accountable to voters as President Trump does going into the fall. The Chinese government can certainly continue with their messaging. So I'm not so sure that the Chinese government feels like they need to make the deal right now because they understand that they can control some of the levers in the economy.
I know we don't even know the details of phase one, but I am curious when it gets to phase two, is there a sense of what might be touched that wouldn't have been touched in phase one?
Well, phase two is certainly going to be key because, I pointed to the structural issues earlier. The subsidies for Chinese state-owned companies, American companies have long said that has put them at an unfair advantage or disadvantage going into the Chinese market. That's something that hasn't been addressed in phase one. The tech transfers is another one. We know that there are initial discussions or wording that's been placed in this 86-page document for phase one, but phase two is really going to get at the heart of that. And then there's the issue of intellectual property theft.
Right.
If you go back to what the Chinese have said, they have never really come forward and acknowledged that that's actually happening. So I would argue that phase two is really where the difficult work has to be done.
Akiko Fujita, I want to thank you very much for joining us, Akiko. Fascinating look at China and the trade war.